Another in my series of videos on why Jewish apologetics are so bad. This video is Rabbi Mark Wilds and Rabbi Tovia Singer discussing how we know the Torah is divine.
A lot of people who come to MJE, I see this a lot, believe in God, but not necessarily that God wrote the Torah. What do you say to people? I know you give talks about this. I know this is a concern for you. What is your best argument? If you can sort of share it on one foot, if you don't mind.
Sure. As it turns out, well over more than 1 out of 2 people who share our planet, more than half the world's population, although many of them are not crazy about us, believe that our Torah is the Word of God.
Okay, a lot of people believe something, just like a lot of people believe that Jesus was resurrected. Why do I care?
Muslims do not believe the New Testament's the Word of God. They don't even like it. And Christians do not like the Quran. They just don't. For whatever reason, it's not important. But the one thing they can agree on, regardless of what they think about Jews, is that Torah is divinely inspired, and their religions are all predicated on the Torah of Moses. Moses in Islam is considered the highest Rasul, only second to Muhammad. I mean, Moses is way up there, and his revelation is the highest. And Christians believe the same thing.
So these people who you think believe all kinds of crazy shit also believe in the divinity of the Torah? That's not very encouraging to me.
And the question is why? And this is what I would say to any Jew who's wondering about his faith. Why is it that the nations of the world are so awestruck by the Torah?
Well, they're also awestruck by a lot of other crazy shit, so I don't really care what makes people awestruck. I care what corresponds to reality, what has evidence.
And what is so unique about it? And as it turns out, the Torah predicts this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, the Torah says, look, this is what's going to happen. All the nations are going to say, what a wise nation this is, speaking about the Jewish people, the children of Israel, that has such a wise law. So the Torah, written in the Bronze Age, predicts that the world will be enraptured with the Jewish people and the Torah of the Jew, of the law of the Jew. However, the same chapter says, be aware that despite this, they're going to exile you, and you'll be in all nations, remaining few in number. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 27. What is going on here?
Well, whatever is going on, it's probably going on during or after the Babylonian exile. That's an important thing to know about Deuteronomy. But what was the question? What do you say to people who doubt that God wrote the Torah? I think that was the question. Are we getting to an answer? What's the evidence that God wrote the Torah?
So the author of the text is saying something very complicated, saying they're going to love your Torah, but you're going to be a problem and they're going to exile you. Why is the Torah so attractive? What is so unique about the Jewish claim that the whole world latches onto it?
I don't actually think the Torah is all that attractive to Muslims and Christians, and that's why they hardly concern themselves with it. Muslims are infatuated with the Quran. That's it. They don't need anything else. Any Old Testament stories they know are going to be the versions from the Quran. And Christians hardly have any use for the Old Testament either, except the verses that they see as foreshadowing Jesus. There's nothing appealing to Muslims or Christians in the Torah's legal codes or tabernacle assembly instructions. Yes, these religions launched themselves from Judaism, but they did so by largely superseding the Jewish scriptures with their own revelations and covenants, which were, in their opinion, better.
And that is the type of revelation. The revelation is one of a national revelation. It's completely unique.
Are you saying that the reason Muslims and Christians are attracted to the Torah is because of the unique national revelation? But both of those faiths superseded that revelation with their own relatively private revelations. So it doesn't seem like the national revelation impressed them all that much. They think their own revelations are better.
That is our formidable event.
Well, it is the formidable event for Judaism today, that we know. If you ask a random religious Jew to tell you about Sinai, they will tell you about a tradition of public revelation and receiving the Torah. Now, will they be able to tell you exactly the sequence of events from this formidable episode that is recorded in the book of Exodus? Absolutely not. Because the account recorded there is incomprehensible. It's a pastiche of several traditions that cannot be put into a unified timeline. But if you mean that a national revelation at Sinai is the formidable event of Judaism going all the way back to the beginning, to that alleged event, well, that is actually a claim that needs to be established, not something we can assume. When did national revelation at Sinai become an event in Israelite tradition? We'll definitely be coming back to this question, but it is quite intriguing that in most places you would fully expect to see something about the formidable event at Sinai mentioned in the Torah. It is not. Anyway, let's hear more about the formidable event, and then getting back to the original question, how do we know that God wrote the Torah?
We believe in Abraham and his encounter with three angels in Genesis 18 based on faith. We have no evidence for that.
Right, it's just a story, a myth.
The foundation of our faith is the event that occurred at Mount Sinai a little more than 3,300 years ago when an unprecedented revelation took place.
That's also a story, a myth, and has no more evidence in its favor than the angels speaking to Abraham. Continue.
Where the entire nation, every Jew was present and heard the voice of God.
Okay, that is the claim in the Bible, at least in Deuteronomy, although not in Exodus, but again, there's no more evidence for this than for the Abraham thing. Why is it anything other than a myth? You can tell a story about angels, you can tell a story about animals, and you can tell a story about people hearing God, and they're all just stories, mythology.
Moreover, I submit this to you. We're now between holidays. Every Jewish holiday is based on an event that affected the entire nation.
So what?
Passover, celebrating in Exodus, miracles that occurred on a national scale. We all experienced it.
I didn't. Did you? How old are you really? So far, you're just repeating a story that you heard. You can't prove the myth is true by just repeating the myth.
Passing through the Red Sea, on dry land, receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, which we are going to celebrate in just a few weeks from now.
I assume you're referring to the holiday of Shavuot, which the Bible does not in any way connect to Mount Sinai or to receiving the Torah. So if we can pause right here, you're giving us a great example of a claim about our own history, which has completely saturated popular Jewish thought and tradition, and that claim is that Shavuot commemorates the giving of the Torah at Sinai, but which was utterly unknown to the authors of the Bible. In the Bible, Shavuot is just the first fruits holiday. So let's keep this in mind when you tell us later that it is impossible to introduce new traditions or new accounts of historical events. You just gave us an example of a fact about our own history that was not known in the biblical period so far as we can tell. It was introduced later. And that's the kind of thing that happens in religious traditions all around the world.
The Festival of Tabernacles, a national event where God preserved our people for 40 years in a wilderness.
Okay, you're still just telling me the story, which I've already heard many, many times. Aren't you supposed to be proving that God wrote the Torah?
All Hanukkah, all of our holidays are not
public,
like...
very public. And what would you say?
The whole nation was there.
The whole nation was where? You mean in the mythology? Don't just repeat the mythology. Tell me how you know God wrote the Torah.
Would you say then, which obviously is in contradistinction to the Christian view of, right?
Easter, like who was there? Like two ladies? I mean, right. Every other one is different. There's one exception, Rabbi. I just want to share this one thing with you. There's only one other type of holiday that that celebrates national events, and that's secular American holidays.
Are we getting off track here?
When you celebrate July 4th, the reason why Americans celebrate is because of a national event that occurred to the people of the United States of America. Isn't that interesting?
Well, since you brought it up, it is interesting from the standpoint that almost none of the people celebrating that holiday had anything to do with the events that it celebrates. Americans today are generally not the descendants of the Americans who experienced independence. A nation is a geopolitical abstraction, not a family tree. I mean, my ancestors were living somewhere in Poland or Russia during the American Revolution. But I adopted the history of the United States because I am American, as did hundreds of millions of other Americans. So, are you telling us to think of the Jewish holidays in the same way? We celebrate events that we personally and ancestrally had no connection to? We adopted in other people's history? That seems interesting in the very opposite way that you are imagining, doesn't it? You're saying we could be the descendants of immigrants who adopted another nation's mythology and don't actually share that history except in national memory. Is that what you're going for?
But all the other religious holidays, no matter which one, celebrate some event that you take their word for it or don't take their word for it.
Same as Judaism. We take the Bible's word for it, right? What other source do you have?
But it's never a national revelation.
Okay, fine. We have a story of national revelation. Actually, many versions of this story, which contradict each other in various ways. But aren't you supposed to be proving the Torah is divine, written by God, and not just a bunch of stories?
Thank you. And what do you then say to someone who's listening to this and says, okay, that's great if I was one of those people who lived thousands of years ago and I was part of witnessing that great event, the Exodus from Egypt, the giving of the Torah at Sinai. It wasn't just to a few disciples, it was to everyone, but I wasn't there. And you're asking me to just simply believe that this event took place. What's the response to that? What's the next step then?
Okay, Rabbi Wilds is on the right track here. Let's see how long he can stay on track. For any religious myth, you'd want to ask, did this myth really happen the way it's reported in the tradition? And what ways do I have to establish that? In most cases, there are none, but you can at least try to determine how far back the myth goes. You can say, well, this is a genuinely old myth. That doesn't tell you it's true, it just tells you it's old. But if a national revelation at Sinai was the formidable event of Judaism, as you say, and therefore it would have to be a very old myth, you would expect it to be referenced throughout the Bible like the Exodus is. You would expect all the prophets to be saying, remember when God spoke to you at Sinai. But that is very much not the case at all. Let's do a quick review, and I'll try to make it very quick, of how Sinai is viewed outside of those few chapters in Exodus and Deuteronomy that describe that event. The Book of Numbers never mentions a public revelation at Mount Sinai and barely even mentions Mount Sinai. When God wants to remind the Israelites of who they are dealing with, he always describes himself as the God who took them out of Egypt, not as the God who revealed himself or anything else at Mount Sinai. Numbers 33 provides a lovely itinerary of the Israelites' travels through the wilderness, commencing with the Exodus from Egypt. Colorful notes are inserted in several places, such as the stop named Elim had 12 springs and 70 palm trees. Wow. And what does it have to say about Sinai? Nothing at all. Pretty boring place. Deuteronomy 6:20-25, right after Moses' review of the Ten Commandments, explains exactly what you are supposed to tell your children when they ask you about your laws. So this would definitely be the time to tell them about the revelation at Sinai, right? Nope, not interested. In the Credo of Deuteronomy 26, which we are all familiar with as the central text of the Haggadah, it sounds like the Israelites came out of Egypt and into the Promised Land with nothing else worth mentioning in between. Amos 2:10 also presents this truncated version of the wilderness experience. The Israelites came out of Egypt, passed through the wilderness, and now here they are, the end. Nothing of any interest happened in the wilderness. In Psalm 105, the only events in the wilderness worth mentioning are the magic food and the magic rock. Psalm 106 remembers Datan and Aviram, as well as the golden calf or something like it at Horeb, but no revelation. Psalm 78, again, the magic food and the magic rock are the big events of the wilderness. How about Psalm 136? Whoops, missed it again. Micah 6:4, he brought us out of Egypt. 1 Samuel 12:8, he brought us out of Egypt. Jeremiah 2:6, he led us through the wilderness. In Joshua 24, Joshua reviews Israelite history down from Abraham to his own day. Does he mention anything at all about the Sinai event? He does not. And even passages that do mention law-giving or covenants in the wilderness omit mention of public revelation. 1 Kings 8:9, God made a covenant. No mention of a public revelation. Ezekiel 20:11, I gave them my laws and taught them my rules. No mention of the revelation. So, based on the majority of biblical sources, you have to conclude that the only formidable event in Judaism is really the Exodus from Egypt. In most of these sources, a revelation at Sinai is not even a footnote, and even when it does indicate that a covenant or a teaching occurred in the wilderness, it does not say there was any sort of public revelation. So we have to leave a giant question mark over whether we should consider the revelation at Sinai to be a, quote, formidable event in Judaism. It seems that it was probably added at a much later point than the other core myths. Anyway, let's go on, and let's see if you can remember that you're trying to demonstrate the divinity of the Torah here, not just that someone made an interesting or unique story.
Right. So think this through very carefully. There's a lot at stake here.
Okay, then I'm expecting something really, really good. This is going to be rock solid, right?
What are the origins of the Torah?
Right, that was what Rabbi Wilds originally asked you about 5 minutes ago, but I'm glad we're back on track now.
Is it divine or human? Someone wrote it.
Right.
Yes, not just one person, but a lot of people. Go on.
Either God is behind it, or just a bunch of men who lived 3,000 during the Bronze Age are behind it.
Well, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and much, much later as well. Bible scholars agree that it was written by many different people at many different times.
The consequences are staggering.
Right. So your demonstration better be really, really good. I'm not going to believe some crazy shit happened 3,000 years ago unless you really give me an airtight case. So go.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, if it's God did it, then I should do it.
Well, I don't really see why you should. What if it's full of horrible stuff and the deity or maybe demon who wrote it is a really horrible character? What if it was written by the god Kronos after he castrated his father and ate his own children? Would you still feel compelled to follow that book? Conversely, if it was written by mere humans, it might still contain some very good stuff worth doing.
Men just thought pork was a bad idea. Well, that was good then, but bacon, that doesn't apply to bacon today. So, is God behind this?
Yes, I believe that was the question, and I think everyone listening to Rabbi Wilds knew that that was the question. Glad you're finally getting to it.
So here, now listen and think very carefully. If men invented this, wrote this book, and they made it up, they made up the stories, they then present, at some point someone wrote it. Somebody wrote it thousands of years ago.
At a variety of different times, yes, most likely long after the stories began circulating orally. The vast majority of people at this time were illiterate and were not reading or writing anything. When oral traditions were finally put into writing, it was by professional scribes employed by kings, who generally had some agenda or motivation for doing this. But yes, at some points these stories were told, probably in various forms, and at some point they were written down, probably in various forms, and at some point they were edited into what we today call the Torah.
And then it's given to a people and told, here is your history, right? What would the people then ask if it never happened? There was no Egypt, no Joshua, no Moses. They'll go, what?
Well, no, because you could imagine people already being familiar with many of those myths. Every culture has myths. There's nothing mysterious about that. And then someone can introduce something a little new that plays off and resonates with the existing myths. How do people respond to that innovation? Well, that really depends. If they are illiterate farmers and the innovation is introduced by the priests or elders that they trust, then they probably accept it as being as true as all the other things the priests and elders taught them previously. In fact, We can actually check such a scenario. In 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, the people were told that King Josiah found a new scroll of the law that said they were supposed to be worshiping Yahweh exclusively and doing a bunch of other stuff that they didn't know about previously. Did they all say,
What?
No, they didn't. In Nehemiah, the people were read a new scroll produced by Ezra that told them about laws they never knew before. Did they say,
What?
No, they didn't. When Moses in Deuteronomy relates event after event that completely contradict what the people should have known from their own history less than 40 years earlier, do they say,
What?
No, they don't. Now, of course, all these episodes are themselves stories, but the expectation in the Bible is that people do not challenge new information that is presented to them by the people in authority. And it's also, of course, those authorities who are ultimately recording these stories. We always need to keep that in mind because, in fact, there could have been massive resistance to certain mythological innovations. People could have said,
What?
and we might still never have heard about it because those refuseniks, whoever they were not the ones writing the scriptures that we ended up getting. Perhaps they ended up as one of the many sects that we know still existed in Second Temple times, or perhaps they simply vanished entirely. So this idea that people would have said,
What?
is simply not an argument for anything. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, and we could have exactly the same record in either case. It tells us nothing.
How come no one told us about this?
Yeah, I could see where intuition might lead you to say that, but nevertheless, in the biblical stories that we have that relate to just this situation, people don't say that. And the reasons could be many, but first and foremost, like I said before, these are all just stories, and all we know is what the storyteller ultimately wants to tell us. In reality, if there were any objections, we would probably never know about it. But assuming the events in 2 Kings and Nehemiah are somewhat accurate, we could assume that the people who are being instructed in their history by Josiah or later by Ezra simply had no other information. There was no concept of a written Torah that could be consulted for historical information until some point well after the Babylonian exile. Second, when the king or the priest or the scribe says,
Here is your history.
well, who would know better than them? Your illiterate grandfather does not know history better than the king and his professional staff of scribes, priests, and prophets. And for those who were skeptical, the authorities have a ready answer, and it's right there in the narrative. Your ancestors knew all this once, but they forgot. Just like they forgot about Yahweh himself again and again and again and again and again. And for those who could absolutely not be satisfied with the new history, well, they may have ended up like the idolatrous priests that Josiah massacred, but regardless, their complaints are not included in the new history. Too bad, so sad. So if they didn't write their own history, and they didn't because they were probably illiterate, then whatever history they had before is gone.
So that means the book is not making a claim that some prophet met an angel in some remote area. This happened to you, to your forefathers.
So, who are you to say it didn't? You are an illiterate Iron Age farmer, and the priests and the king are the keepers of the national wisdom and history. They are the ones who know these things. And people in primitive cultures believe all kinds of crazy ideas about what happened to their ancestors. And at some point, they had to be introduced to those crazy ideas. They weren't born with their mythology in their brains. So why is it so surprising that Israelite people would also be introduced to crazy ideas and believe crazy ideas? I just don't see why this confounds you so much.
So the people would have to respond, if this was invented, if this is a human document, then how come no one told me?
No, you wouldn't respond that way because you are an illiterate farmer and you are not the keeper of the tradition. There are professionals employed by the king who do that, and you are not one of them. And if you don't go along with it, then you are either dead or you're out of the community. And your story is done as far as we Jews of today are concerned. Maybe your story continued somewhere else for some other sect, but we Jews today have the story of the people who did go along with it. And again, in the episodes that address this exact situation in the Bible, nobody has to respond the way you imagine.
So the people would have to respond if this was invented, if this is a human document, then how come no one told me?
And nobody does respond the way you imagine, because they are being told their history from exactly the people that they expect and trust to be telling them their history.
And then what would you do? You'd have to say it was some big secret. No one was supposed to tell anybody.
Well, funny you should say that, because the Bible tells us the exact formula. It's right there in 2 Kings 22:13. For great indeed must be God's wrath that has been kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this scroll to do all that has been prescribed for us. And it's right there in Nehemiah 9:26. Then, defying you, they rebelled, they cast your teaching behind their back, they killed your prophets who admonished them to turn back to you, they committed great impieties. And it's there in 2 Chronicles 29:6. For our fathers trespassed and did what displeased the Lord our God. They forsook him and turned their faces away from the dwelling place of the Lord, turning their backs on it. And it's right there in about 100 other places. Here's Isaiah 1:3. An ox knows its owner, a donkey its master's crib. Israel does not know. My people take no thought. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children. They have forsaken God, spurned the Holy One of Israel, turned their backs. Or if you want, check Jeremiah 5:31, or 16:11, or 23:27. The formula for explaining why you don't know is that your ancestors were sinful, their prophets were deceitful, they worshipped other gods and forgot Yahweh. And that explains why you are today ignorant of all these important things. Your ancestors broke the covenant. Why didn't they tell you about Yahweh and his formidable revelation? Because they weren't worshiping Yahweh. Yahweh was not their God. So, if the question that's really bothering you about the introduction of a new myth is that people would say,
Like, how come no one told us about this?
the Bible addresses that objection again and again and again. No one told you because your ancestors dropped the ball. There's hardly any theme in the Bible that is drilled more relentlessly than this. The Jews screwed up Judaism for hundreds of years. That's the formula.
Right? You'd have to say something. You'd have to explain, like, if it never happened, like, how did, if it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
And like I said, it's amply explained. And also, it actually doesn't need to be explained because we are only getting the story from the people who wrote the story. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather might have had some objections and might have said,
If it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
but your great-great-great-great-grandfather didn't get to write the Bible. Someone else did, so we got their story.
But as it turns out, the author of the book,
that's the story. In other words, the story we've been telling.
it's a story of your
The
history.
story of our history is
not
that these Jews
right.
were gathered around a mountain. They had been
Right.
slaves.
This is right.
So let's say it was written by a human being. That human being would then have to somehow convince a nation that they were these descendants of these people that were enslaved or stood at
Right.
Sinai.
Sure, and new Jews are being convinced every day. You think it's hard to convince people that they are the descendants of ancestors who stood at Sinai? It's not hard. Go into any yeshiva and you'll find hundreds or thousands of kids who are convinced that they are the descendants of people who stood at Sinai. And they grow into adults, like you two, who are convinced that they are the descendants of people who stood at Sinai. What about this is so bewildering to you?
But that big of an event, I mean, this is what you're arguing. I just want to clarify it. That big of an event had to have been heard by somebody.
Well, it wasn't, was it? Did any other nation in the ancient Near East report 3 million Israelites in the vicinity of a Mount Sinai? That number of people would have been more than all the cities of the ancient Near East put together. And do we see a record of this Sinai event anywhere in the books of the prophets? No. So like you say, if it happened, you would think someone would have heard about it, but we don't see that. And again, 2 Kings and Nehemiah shows exactly how you can sell a new history and even a new God to people who have no other written tradition. And selling a big event may sometimes just be selling a small detail if all the other parts are there already. We'll see that in just a moment. But remember, based strictly on the Bible itself, it seems like many of the traditions related to Sinai did not exist until after the Babylonian exile. There simply was no big event, perhaps not until Ezra read his scroll to the Babylonian exiles. But I think what may still bother some people, including the good Rabbi Wilds here, is that if there was no actual public revelation at Sinai, how could this tradition ever get going from the start? Now, listen to this. If the tradition is simply being started anew by Ezra or Josiah or some other authority figure, and it's being presented as a corrected history, there's just nothing to explain. We didn't know about it because our great-grandparents were sinful and abandoned it. That's the end. You can't investigate it further. Who are you going to ask? The king and his prophets say that your distant ancestors turned away from God and broke the covenant. They forgot this and that and the other thing. They forgot it all. But now, the king and his prophets are reminding you about the truth of how things really are and how things really were. And that's the end of that discussion. You can't pursue it any further beyond the king and his prophets. Think of it like this. You probably know that Nicholas Copernicus was the first to hypothesize the heliocentric model of the solar system. The Earth goes around the sun, contrary to what everyone else believed in antiquity and the Middle Ages. We know this as the Copernican Revolution, after Nicholas Copernicus. That's the history we've all been taught. Now let's say this comes up in a conversation with a historian, and she says, actually, Aristarchus of Samos came up with that idea 1,700 years earlier. So you say,
If it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
And she says, yeah, it's funny. That piece of history just somehow got lost for a couple thousand years. So what do you say to her? Do you tell her she's lying because you didn't hear about it? Or do you believe her? She's the authority and you're not. Of course, in the modern day and age, you can go and investigate a claim like this on your own. There are a lot of avenues to get information, but if you're an illiterate Iron Age farmer, you don't have any avenues to get information. And you can't ask your father or grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather because they're ignorant for the same reason that you're ignorant. You have to trust the authorities. In this case, the authority happens to be correct. Your particular version of history and your father's version of history and your grandfather's version of history are all wrong for the very same reason. The knowledge was lost, and that's why you don't have it. So, for myself, I don't think that ancient people would object to changes in mythology that are introduced to them by trusted teachers and elders, and that would include the king, the prophets, the priests, and so on. Those are the people who know things. But anyway, if you believe there must have been at least some kernel of truth to work with, well, that's fine. Let's see how a myth is made. Let's say a culture has a tradition that there's a mountain called the Mountain of God because people say you can see God there. That's a perfectly nice ideological myth that you would expect to find among primitive people, and you can see something like that in Genesis 22:14. So far, so good. Let's say there's another myth that Moses goes to meet God on the mountain and obtain a covenant for the Israelites. That's basically Exodus 19:3-8. These are myths, just like the Abraham myth, so you don't need to ask if any of this actually happened. Cultures make up stuff like this all the time. We don't ask if these things are true or not. They are mythology, which is what human cultures create everywhere. There are no exceptions to this. But if you want to think these events actually happened, that's fine too. Anyway, continuing on. Another myth says that there was thunder and lightning on the mountain and the people were very afraid. Again, that's basically Exodus 20:15. Another myth says that God spoke to Moses in the thunder, such as Exodus 19:19. And another myth that Moses gave God's covenant to the Israelites, such as in 24:7. And they all said, "We will faithfully do it." All just a bunch of myths, no public revelation whatsoever. Believe them or don't believe them. Now, we have no idea which of these myths, if any, the Babylonian returnees would have been carrying with them, but let's say they had something like this set of myths that I just went through. Then along comes Ezra and says, God came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. Being that there are no other written sources to check against, would anyone really object to this? Okay, their own myths don't have God actually speaking to the Israelites. That's a bit of a change. But why not? It actually makes more sense. God speaks to people all the time in the pagan world, and in the Bible for that matter. The Judahites' existing myths that we mentioned already say that the people were there, God was there, the mountain was there, the covenant was there, the thunder was there. So Moses heard God's voice in the thunder, and the Israelites heard God's voice in the thunder too. It's even better. There, we just made a new myth. Was that so hard? Frankly, taking any existing myth and just tacking on everyone saw it at some later time is trivially easy if the myth is already believed. Let's say, for example, that everyone believes the myth that Moses hit the rock and water came out. No one doubts that this is what happened. But it's a myth. Then someone tacks on, and everyone saw it. Who would object to that addition to the existing myth? And how would you verify it? If everyone knows about it and no one doubts it, then it's easy to say that's because everyone saw it. This is the easiest free rider claim to add to an existing myth.
Right? It can't just be made
Right.
up and then, right.
Right. In 100 years from now, I mean, if 9/11 never happened 100 years from now, someone just made it up, you'll go, well, 9/11, such a cataclysmic event? Like, why didn't anybody say anything about that?
No. Let's do it better. 600 years from now, there have been wars, countries destroyed, new countries born, natural disasters, epidemics, migrations, exiles, genocides. Whatever happened in a place called New York in 2001 is of no concern to anyone anymore. 600 years from now, let's say. And now someone tells you about what happened on 9/11. Well, you can challenge that person, and they'll just say, well, no one knows about it anymore. It was huge at the time, but it was forgotten, and that was a mistake. And this response works whether or not they are telling the truth about the event. That's why it's such a great response. And this is exactly the approach that the Bible takes when it's reprimanding the Jews for failing in their devotion to Yahweh. You have forgotten. Deliberately or not, you have forgotten. And that was a huge mistake. And that's why we see all the warnings in Deuteronomy, lest you forget, lest you forget, lest you forget. It's setting up exactly this justification for your current ignorance. So the biblical authors know exactly how to handle the situation when people object.
If it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
It's because your ancestors forgot. The ancient authors already anticipated this. So I still don't know why you are so stumped by it.
There's not one individual you take his word for it and not take his word for it.
Well, yes, it is, in the case of Ezra or Josiah or Moses.
Exactly. So the text would have to, buried into the text, would have to have a method, a device, a plot device to explain this away.
Okay. The device is there. The device is that all this stuff was known to your ancestors in the days of Moses and Aaron. You don't know this stuff because your later ancestors were sinful and forgot about Yahweh. This device clobbers you over the head again and again and again on almost every page of the Bible. I don't understand how you can be a scholar of the Bible and not notice it. In fact, it might not even be an exaggeration to say that the literary device that you are looking for, the device that explains why you don't know about Yahweh, that device is the Bible.
Because this will be the book is saying this is your history. And as it turns out, so the book would have to say your parents don't know about it because there's some secret.
Oh my God. That is exactly what the book does say. Your parents don't know about it because your freaking ancestors lost the tradition. But we, Josiah or Ezra, are here to fix all that and get things back on track.
But it's the very reverse. And this is why it's so compelling about Torah. It's not just Jews have discovered that the world has. And that is, the text says the following. The author of the book says, look, you have questions. I'm going to tell you what I want you to do. Sha'al avicha v'yagedcha zikeinecha v'yomer lach. Deuteronomy chapter 32. If you have questions, ask your daddy. He knows all about it.
Does your daddy have some independent account separate from what Moses allegedly wrote? I don't think so, unless he's a heretic. And if your daddy was alive in the time of Josiah, he didn't have the tradition. That's plain enough.
Ask your elders. They'll recite it to you. And I want you to do the following. Every year I want you to gather together and v'higad to levincha b'yemahu, and you should tell your children, and your children will ask and you tell them.
Wait. Let's just pause there for a second. You just cited two different verses. The first one is in the context of the Passover, Exodus 13:8, and has nothing to do with Sinai. The Sinai narrative doesn't start until chapter 19. It says there in verse 13-14 that your children will ask you, but again, this is well before Sinai, so why is that at all relevant to this discussion? The other place the Bible mentions your children asking you is Deuteronomy 6:20, which is after Moses retells the events of the Sinai experience, and the answer there conspicuously omits anything about Sinai. So all of these verses you mention about teaching your children or asking your elders have nothing to do with a revelation at Sinai. Is Rabbi Wilds going to call you out on this bullshit? Probably not, I'm guessing. You know you're going to get away with it because you've been getting away with it for years and years and years. Good going.
The author of the book had no such concern.
No such concern about what? The authors of the verses you cited didn't know anything about a revelation at Sinai, so what exactly would they have been concerned about?
It's just the opposite. The author of the book says if you want to know more about this event that happened to you, not to Eskimos.
The author of which verses? The ones that don't know anything about the Sinai event?
But to you, this is your history. Go to your grandparents, they know all about it.
What account do your grandparents have separate from what Moses allegedly wrote? I mean, how absurd is this going to get? This is like telling a child, if you want to learn more about the Lorax, go ask your father to read you the Lorax. And if you want to learn even more about the Lorax, go ask your grandfather to read you the Lorax. And both of you are obviously intelligent people, but this is ridiculous. I start to wonder whether some aspect of this discussion is just a performance and that neither of you really believe what you're saying. Who are you performing for? But by the way, the passage you cite there is from the so-called Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, which really has nothing to do with anything in the surrounding narrative. It's just kind of jammed in there. Here's the verse. It's something about God giving the nations their homes, not anything about national revelation or whatever. What's funny is that in this poem, not only is there no revelation, there's not even an exodus. God simply finds the Israelites in the desert. So, sure, go ask your grandfather about the non-existent Exodus and the non-existent Sinai. Should be a very interesting discussion.
Therefore, the book actually locks that in. So therefore, only the origins must have been divine. It must have actually occurred to our people.
What? I missed that. The book locks that in? Locks what in? In your view, what was there ever other than the book? Moses wrote the book. You believe that. The book is what we have. What we have is Moses' account. So what is locked in, and when did it get locked in, and by whom? I'm totally confused. There never was any other account. That is the Orthodox Jewish belief, and I have to assume it's your belief. And if putting something into official written form locks it in, then why couldn't a tradition get locked in this way at a later time? How about this? Before Ezra, there was a multitude of different traditions alive in the culture. Then Ezra wrote his scroll, and a certain tradition that he picked got locked in. How does that sound?
Well, moreover, Deuteronomy chapter 32 says, Deuteronomy chapter 4 says that this is a one-time event in history.
Why do I care what it says? It's just a fairy tale, and you haven't shown otherwise.
No other
the giving
nation
of the Torah is a one event.
was one time. Ata hareis ladas, you have been shown this, hareis ladas, that you may know, not have faith.
Okay, are you now quoting the Bible to prove the divinity of the Bible? What are you trying to demonstrate? I feel like this discussion has gone off the rails at this point. This is now just a sermon. The Bible is divine because the Bible is divine. Rabbi Wilds, are you going to call Rabbi Singer out on this bullshit or not? I can hear this bullshit from any Orthodox rabbi anywhere. You invited Rabbi Singer presumably because he's going to give a rational argument in favor of divine authorship. Are you going to make him do that?
Why? That I am God. And ask, has there ever been, the text asks the question, Sha'alna l'yamim rishonim. The Torah, the author of the book, is speaking to you and is saying, think back through all time in history. Has there ever been any other nation that has had a national revelation and survived, that has been delivered on a national scale and is here to talk about it? The answer is no. Ata hareis ladas is the response to that. It never happened.
Well, I agree it never happened, and it never happened to the Israelites either, but in pagan religions, meeting gods was not a big deal, so you wouldn't really expect an account like this from polytheists. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. But you are supposed to be proving the divinity of the Torah, that God wrote the Torah, not that it has some unique and entertaining stories. When do you plan to start doing that? Your video is almost over.
My friends, the Torah is so delicious. It's mamish mili mali, it's words that are so high, so delicious. And the text, God understands you. He loves you. You're created in His image. So the Torah is pregnant with information so that you can know the origins are divine, not human.
Are you going to share this information with us? Because I've watched this far and I haven't heard it from you.
Because the text is saying, go to your people. They know all about it.
All about what? The verses you gave don't know anything about an event at Sinai. And why should I believe them anyway? Are you seriously telling me to believe a book because the book says that I should believe it?
And that's why this is what's so delicious about the relationship between God and the Jews. We're really married. The Jewish people are a witness people who bear testimony to the Torah.
Well, that's lovely, but you may recall that the question you were asked was to demonstrate the divinity of the Torah. Now you're just delivering a sermon and Rabbi Wilds is letting you get away with it. Very disappointing.
Conversely, the Torah bears testimony to the uniqueness of Klal Yisrael as being to the nation of Israel as being a light to the nation. And that's why Isaiah tells us, Atem Eidai Nom Hashem, Avdi Asher Bacharti, you are my witnesses, declares the Lord, my servant whom I have declared. So,
okay, nice sermon. Still waiting for any evidence.
God calls to the Jewish people to be His witnesses, to bear testimony. Testimony to what, if it never happened?
If what never happened? Isaiah never mentions Sinai or Horeb or mass revelation. Whatever testimony Isaiah is talking about, it's not what you've been talking about in this video the entire time. So you are on full bullshit mode, and Rabbi Wilds is sitting there and nodding his head. What a nice picture of how discerning Orthodox Jews are when it comes to the biblical text. So let me just say something about this. When I watch these Jewish apologetics videos, which I do quite a lot, what I find absolutely hilarious is that The cornerstone of all the arguments for the authenticity of Jewish tradition is that it would have been impossible for anyone to bullshit our ancestors. Our ancestors would have called that out in 1 second. They would have smelled it from a mile away. They wouldn't stand for anything that didn't have hard evidence to back it up. They would never let anyone play fast and loose with tradition. Oh no. We Jews don't even let bullshit get off the ground. And that's why whatever our ancestors believed could only be the truth. But in all these apologetics videos that I watch, all I see is bullshit on top of bullshit on top of bullshit. It's all distortion of the biblical text, all logical fallacy, no provision of evidence. And Orthodox Jews, like Rabbi Wilds there and his viewers, are happy as pie to swallow it all. The more bullshit, the better. Call in Rabbi Singer. Call in Rabbi Kellerman. Call in Rabbi Gottlieb. Call in Rabbi Mizrahi. We want to hear more bullshit. Yes, we do. We love it. So, when people say, do you really think our ancestors would have let anyone bullshit them? I say, for sure. They would have loved it. They would have asked for more.
And conversely, the text, so that's why the text stands as a testimony to the people, and the people, the Jewish people, bear witness to the authenticity of the text. It's a beautiful marriage made in heaven.
So, nice sermon, but what the hell? What did you say that's supposed to assure me of the divinity of the Torah? Rabbi Wilds asked you, why should I believe that God wrote the Torah? And you gave him and his listeners nothing at all. The only argument I heard remotely along these lines is that it is impossible to introduce historical events at a much later date because these events would be challenged based on existing beliefs about those historical events. They would have called out bullshit. But that's just not the case. We looked at a number of examples in the Bible where new history, new law, new God is introduced to the Israelites and no one objects. No one runs to check the new info against their trusty Torah scroll because they don't have a Torah scroll and they are not even worshiping the Jewish God anyway. The only way anyone can verify anything is by asking a priest or a prophet because there are no authoritative sources of historical information. We also noted how myths can grow and merge together and create new myths which also do not occasion any objections and which are not open to any disconfirmation, certainly not by illiterate farmers. And if there were objections and those objectors will likely be suppressed anyway. And, there is a reductio ad absurdum here. Your claim is that you cannot introduce a new national history at a late date because people will call bullshit and say,
if it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
Therefore, whatever national history we have must be original and true. But this makes every culture's origin mythology trivially true, no matter how absurd. For example, Persian folklore tells of a character named Jamshid, a king who improved the lives of his people with many inventions, including weaponry, medicine, and navigation. If we follow your thinking, this myth has to be true. If it wasn't true, it would mean that someone came to the Persians and said,
here is your history.
And they would say,
if it happened, why didn't anyone tell me about this?
And the news story would never get off the ground. Since we have that story and it didn't get shot down, it must be true. And I think you begin to see that the nature of the historical claim doesn't even matter. Although apologists like yourself talk a lot about the unique public nature of the Sinai revelation.
Unprecedented revelation took place where the entire nation, every Jew was present and heard the voice of God.
That is actually a red herring and doesn't enter into the argument. What actually matters to your argument is that a fabricated history cannot replace an existing mythology that's already known to people. And if you believe this, then any time people say, "we have a tradition," you are forced to concede that their tradition is true. If it wasn't, it could never have been introduced. And that's going to be the case for every folk history around the world, in every age, however flagrantly preposterous. So the more you think about this argument, the more ludicrous it sounds. And you're telling us that everything in Judaism is riding on this argument.
The consequences are staggering.
This is the triumphant proof for the divinity of the Torah. If this proof doesn't work, then there's no reason to think that the Torah is divine. Well, I'm sorry, it does not work. This is some bad apologetic.